Hello, today we're going to take a look at how religion and coping come together. We've already touched on this topic, but in today's video, we get to explore it in more depth. For me, this is a very interesting topic to consider the circumstances under which some of us turn to religion during times of crisis, and others of us turn away from religion or may not even consider it. So we get to look at some of the factors in this chapter of Pargament, chapter 6, that shed light on these kinds of coping behaviors involving the intersection of religion and coping. So we might begin by considering, how does Pargament actually define coping? And as you are probably already aware, he defines coping as the search for significance during times of stress. Well, you may be reminded of Pargament's definition of religion when he talks about how religion is the search for significance in ways related to the sacred. So we can see that religious coping is only a part of religion. There's a lot more to religion than how we may turn to our religion to help us during times of struggle, but that is an important part of a religious orientation to life. As we already know, more than just helping us cope, religion can provide an overarching framework for living. As William James said, in thinking about religion and coping, man's extremity is God's opportunity. So this brings us to an interesting question posed by Pargament in this chapter, when he asks us, are there really no atheists in foxholes? To start with, perhaps we need to talk about what is a foxhole. The only reason why I bring this question up is because some students have asked this question in the past, having never heard of foxholes. They thought it was a hole that a fox lives in. But as you're probably aware, a foxhole is a hole that's dug out by a soldier during times of battle to protect himself and other people. So imagine a soldier in combat in a very stressful, life-threatening situation, and we're asking the question, in that circumstance, could there be atheists? That is, people who would not turn to God, look to God, believe in God, ask God for help, protection in such an imminent, life-threatening situation. So as you ponder that question, and you've probably already answered it, I'd like to share with you a couple of interesting stories that are shared in this chapter. The first of these is about the famous Russian author Leo Tolstoy, who was going through a period of crisis in his life. You'll find this story in your book on page 132 and 133, and I would like to share it with you. This is Tolstoy talking. During the whole course of this year, when I almost unceasingly kept asking myself how to end the business, whether by the rope or by the bullet, during all that time, alongside of all those movements of my ideas and observations, my heart kept languishing with another pining emotion. I can call this by no other name than that of a thirst for God. This craving for God had nothing to do with the movement of my ideas. In fact, it was the direct contrary of that movement, but it came from my heart. Another moving account of how uh, a nation turned to religion during times of crisis has to do with the D-Day invasion, which is described in your book on page 133. Parliament says, consider the nation's mood and response on the day before the invasion of Normandy in World War II. The whole country knew on June 6th that something dire, something that might fail, was taking place. In a Brooklyn shipyard, welders knelt on the decks of their Liberty ships and recited the Lord's Prayer. At the opening, the New York Stock Exchange observed 2 minutes of silent prayer. All over America, church bells tolled, and the Liberty Bell was rung in Philadelphia. In Columbus, Ohio, at 7:30 in the evening, all traffic stopped for 5 minutes while people prayed in the streets. So in these examples, we can see how an individual, in the first example, and a country, our nation, in the second example, turn to God during times of stress and crisis. And of course, we can find various stories in the Bible where that takes place as well. But it doesn't work this way for everybody. And getting back to our question, are there any atheists in foxholes? Based on what we learn from Arguments chapter, we would have to say yes, there are some atheists in foxholes. For some people, religion was not a part of their lives before being placed in danger, and it doesn't enter into their lives while in a dangerous situation. There are others of us who perhaps were not religiously oriented, but when we are faced with danger, may turn to God anyway. And there are some who were religious, but because of some bad experiences in their lives, may turn away from religion. So we can see a lot of different possibilities here. One example given in our book of someone who turned away from religion has to do with an individual who was in a concentration camp during World War II. And you'll find his story on page 134 of our book. He says, I used to have a very personal, intimate relationship with God. I thought everything I did and every move I made, God knew and was right there. He'd be there just above me, watching and admonishing and saying, tut, 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 about those inner thoughts I might have. Then the Nazis came. Where did he go? God was no longer near me, disappeared, and I'm no longer the person I was. And of course, there are some people who enter a crisis already uninvolved in religion, and they stay that way. A good example of this is the columnist Stuart Alsop, described in our text on page 134, who had leukemia. He had this to say: I wish I could say that this strange experience with leukemia has given me profound spiritual insights, but it hasn't. The big bearded reality of my childhood is no longer a reality to me. I have been an agnostic since I was about 18. I am an agnostic still. Now, when we review the research examining the extent to which and circumstances under which people either turn toward or away from God during times of crisis, we see a lot of variability in the results of these studies, probably because of methodological differences in how they are conducted. But there are some generalizations that we can draw from looking at this research. First of all, substantial numbers of people involve religion in critical times of life. There are a number of people, though, who also deal with crises without religion. Many people turn towards religion, but many others also turn away from religion or never turn to religion in the first place. But because so many people do turn towards religion during times of crisis, it has been possible to examine different ways in which this occurs in an effort to help us to better understand the relationship between religious life and how we cope with crises. Consider these words of John Heschel that you'll find in your book on page 138. To pray is to take notice of the wonder, to regain a sense of the mystery that animates all beings, the divine margin in all attainments. And consider this quote by psychologist Paul Johnson, found on page 139. When the values of life are at stake, there is reason to be earnest. In times of crisis, religion usually comes to the foreground. The more urgent the need, the more people seek for a response. Another interesting question has to do with considering if religion is expressed more in difficult moments than in less serious ones. And the conclusion we would come to about that is yes for some people. And we're going to explore that question a little bit further in our discussion today. But first, let's look at what Pargament means by religious attributions and why they are relevant in considering how religion and coping come together. You'll find this discussed in your chapter on page 143. But here we're looking at the work of Spilka, Shaver, and Kirkpatrick, in which they identify 3 different areas where attributions are made that can influence whether or not a person turns toward religion during times of crisis. And these are the person, the event, and the context. Simply stated, if a person is already committed to religion, if they already have a religious orientation to life, they will be more likely to turn to religion during times of crisis. Makes sense. Also, thinking about the event, if it is a life-threatening situation, the person is more likely to turn to religion than if it is a less stressful situation. And finally, the context. This has to do with the extent to which the person may live in an environment that supports, nurtures, and encourages their religious orientation to life, such as a church community or friends who are like-minded with their faith. So if we are in a religious context, we might also be more likely to turn to religion during times of crisis. If religion is an important part of our current life, or perhaps it was an important part of our life in the past, we may be more likely to turn towards religion during times of difficulty. Take, for example, the case of Tim that is described in your book on pages 147 and 148. This is a really interesting case study of a young man who was struggling in life with an addiction problem, among other struggles. And he was not at the time of his life when this was going on, especially religiously connected, but he was raised in a religious environment. So he already had learned a lot about God, about the Bible, and a religious way of living. And in the context of his crisis, he turned toward God and eventually experienced the kind of a recreation when both the means and ends of significance in his life rather dramatically changed. So I would encourage you to read his story and really think about how, if religion is already a part of our lives, or perhaps has been a part of our life in the past, it may help us turn toward religion during times of crisis. You remember when we were talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary appraisal? We said that tertiary appraisal is when we select a course of action, and we are more inclined to do those things that we feel compelled to do based on our orienting system to life. And if we have a religious orienting system, that will influence, most likely, whatever steps we take to help ourselves cope with a crisis situation in our lives. So I would like to share with you a quote by Geertz. on page 149. His name is spelled Geertz. Speaking about religious experience during times of crisis, he says, it alters, often radically, the whole landscape presented to common sense, alters it in such a way that the moods and motivations induced by religious practice seem themselves supremely practical, the only sensible ones to adopt given the way things really are. So when we think about the case of Tim and how he helped himself, and we think about it in the context of a religious orienting system, we can appreciate how his way out of his struggles, of his addiction into a better life, was the most compelling solution given his religious orientation to life that was, in a sense, revived in the midst of his crisis. Another fascinating account given in this chapter is described in the book When Prophecy Fails. When Prophecy Fails. And you'll find the story about this real occurrence beginning in your book on page 150. There was a group of people back in the 1950s, we could call them a cult, who believed that the world was coming to an end at Christmas time. They joined together, they sold all their possessions so that they could be ready to be taken to another planet, because this one was going to be devastated, destroyed through floods. And they were convinced that through the help of the Guardians, a group from outer space, who they believed tried to foster spiritual growth of humankind, that the Guardians were going to spare this group of believers and take them up to another planet before the world came to an end. Quoting from the book, group members would presumably survive the flood and remain on the earth until Christmas of the following year, when they would be taken bodily as well as spiritually to Clarion, Venus, or some other planet. There they would be spiritually indoctrinated, preparatory to being sent back to the earth, a cleansed and innocent earth, to repopulate it with good people who, quote, walked in the light. Well, as you may know, the world did not come to an end. So what did the people do then? Well, interestingly, they just hunkered down. They believed even more strongly that it was because of their faith that the world didn't come to an end at that time, but it would be eventually, and that they needed to keep doing what they were doing. When we think about it in terms of tertiary appraisal, it was the most compelling option, because they had given up everything to be a part of this group. So remaining a part of the group and continuing on the same course was the most compelling thing for them to do. Now we might want to say something like, well, these people were obviously psychologically unstable to be in this situation. And that might have been true for some of them. But when you read the accounts of some of these individuals, they sound rather rational. Take this account, which you'll find in your book on page 152, of a medical doctor who was a part of this group. This is what he says. I have given up just about everything. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I cannot afford to doubt. I have to believe. And there isn't any other truth. The preachers and priests don't have it. And you have to look closely to find it even in the Bible. I've taken an awful beating in these last few months. Just an awful beating. But I do know who I am and I know what I've got to do. These are tough times and the way is not easy. We all have to take a beating. I've taken a terrific one, but I have no doubt. So we see in this example, through the tertiary appraisal process, the most compelling solution is selected. Basically, what we're suggesting is that in general, that people cope religiously in part because religion offers more compelling solutions than the alternatives. So a fascinating concept that relates to religion and coping and is discussed in this chapter is the notion of what are called boundary conditions. Boundary conditions, as you may already be aware, are transition and turning points in our lives. There are times often when we go through something scary, perhaps even life-threatening, unexpected, overwhelming, shocking. And they may make us more aware of our vulnerability, our fragility, our mortality. So we may be even more likely to experience the sacred at such times when we are, in a sense, brought to our knees. We may be even more likely to surrender, to ask God for help, to ask others for help, because these boundary conditions touch matters that are basic to our existence. And they also reveal our vulnerability to larger and more powerful sources. Well, there's a fascinating study that's described in our chapter that was done by Hood and colleagues, in which they explored boundary conditions and their impact on people and the extent to which they might turn to religious coping. So in their studies, which you can find described in our book on page 154, they considered boundary conditions to exist when an anticipated stressful situation does not occur, or when a stressful situation is encountered unexpectedly. That is, if we think something bad is going to happen and it does not, or if we don't think something bad is going to happen but it does unexpectedly, these would be examples of boundary conditions. Now, in a clever study, Hood had teenagers go on camping trips. And if they thought the weather was going to be nice, and it wasn't, or if they thought the weather was going to be stormy, but it was nice, for Hood, these conditions supplied by nature created boundary conditions. And what he found was that for these teenagers, when they encountered a boundary condition, they were more likely to have mystical, religious types of experiences than when they did not encounter boundary conditions. So getting back to our earlier example of are there any atheists in foxholes, being in a foxhole would be a kind of boundary condition. It's a scary, life-threatening situation. And I guess what we're suggesting here is that if you were in a foxhole and religion was already a part of your life, you'd probably be more likely to turn to religion than if it weren't. That the tertiary appraisal process would point you in the direction of religious coping being the most compelling thing that you would do in that situation. And we've already established that there are other possible outcomes in a situation like that as well. For somebody who is religious, turns away from religion, somebody who is never religious stays that way, or somebody who is never religious becomes religious in that situation. But what we're saying is that if you already are, if you already have a religious oriented system to life, when faced with a crisis, through the tertiary appraisal process, turning to religion is the most likely thing that we would probably do. It's the most compelling outcome, in other words. So I like this quote in your book on page 155 of the psychiatrist Anton Boysen, talking about boundary situations. He says, as one stands face to face with the ultimate realities of life and death, religion and theology tend to come alive. Meaning tends to outstrip symbol, and we have to seek for new words to express the new ideas which come surging in. Among these ideas, we frequently find the sense of contact with the ultimate reality to which we give the name of God. One final consideration that I would like for us to look at today has to do with whether or not religion is at the boundaries of a person's life or at the center of their life. Because if religion is more at the boundaries of a person's life, then they may be less inclined to turn to religion on a day-to-day basis unless they are confronted with some sort of crisis that creates that fragility, sense of fragility, and vulnerability that boundary conditions can create. But what if religion is at the center of our lives? When that is the case, of course, we will be more likely to turn to religion during times of difficulty, but it's not the only time that we turn to religion, because when religion is at the center of a person's life, then they turn to it every day, and not just when they're going through difficult times. Chances are, much of their life they view as sacred in that particular situation, where religion is at the center of their lives. So, in closing, I would like to talk with you a little bit about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famous Lutheran theologian, German, lived during around the time of World War II. Because of his opposition to Hitler, he was placed in a concentration camp and was eventually killed there. But Bonhoeffer is a very eloquent person who talks about religious matters in ways that can help us to see how we can apply religion to our lives in very meaningful ways. And I would encourage you to read him if you ever get a chance to. But he talked about religion being at the center of life, both for individuals and also on a societal level. And I would like to share with you this quote of his, in which he makes this point. Bonhoeffer says, "I've come to be doubtful of talking about any human boundaries. It always seems to me that we are trying anxiously in this way to reserve some space for God. I should like to speak of God not on the boundaries, but at the center, not in weakness, but in strength, and therefore not in death and guilt, but in man's life and goodness. God is beyond, in the midst of our life. The church stands not at the boundaries where human powers give out, but in the middle of the village." Thank you. I look forward to talking with you again soon.